Good evening, everybody. I'm Meg Russell from the Constitution Unit, here to chair this event. I'd like to give a very warm welcome to all of you who are here in the hall, and we should also welcome those who are watching this event via our live web stream. We don't know where they are and how many of them there are, but they're out there. I need to preface what's going to happen here this evening by just explaining, for those of you who don't already know, why the format of this event has been changed quite radically and suddenly this afternoon, following the very tragic attack on the Labour MP Jo Cox this afternoon, who we have since heard has died. The Leave and Remain campaigns have suspended for a day, and so our main speakers who are going to argue for and against Britain's membership of the EU have withdrawn from this evening. I am delighted to say, well, I should say, obviously, this is a terribly tragic event, and our thoughts are with Jo Cox's friends and family. It's a terrible day for British politics, but I'm pleased to say this is an exceptionally rare event in British politics and something that we should be grateful for that. I'm very pleased that our academic panel have agreed to go ahead with the event. There's obviously a lot of enthusiasm out there in the audience. It's very good that so many of you have come. So we're going to go ahead with an event on a slightly different format, as I will explain. We're obviously here because Britain is standing on the brink of a momentous constitutional decision. Exactly 1 week from today will be the referendum on whether Britain should leave the EU or remain in the EU. This is just the third national referendum that Britain has ever held. And for the last national referendum, the vote on whether we should move to the alternative vote for electing members of the House of Commons back in 2011, the Constitution Unit ran a televised debate in a large hall similar to this, with the format of 2 speakers on each side of the proposition and an academic panel to check the facts that were being presented to the audience by the speakers on either side. The intention was to follow a very similar format for this debate, but obviously that has now changed. If you want to see the last debate, by the way, it is still available online, the video. We were keen to have fact checkers from the very start. It worked very well for our 2011 debate. We planned this a long time ago, and it became, I think, increasingly timely that we should have fact checkers, given that the Constitution Unit, only in the last week, has led an initiative which is now publicly supported by over 250 academics from around the UK, arguing that there has been too much misinformation propagated in this referendum campaign, and that this actually risks undermining the democratic quality of the referendum, because good public decision-making depends on good quality public information. We may speak more about that during the course of this evening. Now we've got a little more time, but if you want to read about that initiative, you can find details on the Constitution Unit website. So it's therefore very appropriate, I think, that UCL, the Constitution Unit, our partners at the European Institute at UCL, and at the UK in a Changing Europe initiative were staging this event in order to have something that we could guarantee would be a high-quality debate based on sound evidence, which rose above the fray of some of what's been going on outside. With our academic panel, we're going to very much be able to stick to that model, at least. This event is the culmination of a series of events that the Constitution Unit, the European Institute, and the UK in a Changing Europe initiative have been holding as partners on the constitutional consequences of Brexit, of a possible Brexit vote. We've held 4 events over recent weeks with some really excellent speakers on the constitutional consequences for Westminster and Whitehall, for the EU and its institutions, for the territorial future of the UK, and for other member states, If any of you out there missed those events, there are briefing papers and videos online that you can find on the Constitution Unit website. I'd also encourage you to follow our blog, where we've been carrying regular posts on the referendum, and to look at our research pages on our website and on the blog to find information on a whole range of other topics that the Constitution Unit covers: Parliament, political parties, elections, referendums, devolution, and much more. And obviously, I encourage you to visit the websites of our partner organisations, the European Institute and the UK in a Changing Europe initiative. There's some information about the event on the screen. It indicates the Twitter hashtag, hashtag UCL Brexit. You will see that we've just tweeted, I hope, the Twitter identities of our 4 speakers. So if any of you want to participate in an online debate via Twitter, do go ahead. But I'm now delighted to introduce our speakers. We have an additional speaker on the panel, as you've probably worked out. But starting from this end, we have Anand Menon, Professor Anand Menon from King's College London, who is the director of the UK in a Changing Europe initiative. We have Swati Dhingra from the LSE, who's an economic specialist. We have Simon Usherwood from the University of Surrey. And we have my colleague, Deputy Director of the Constitution Unit, Alan Rinnick, as an addition to the panel. He led the initiative on the misinformation in the referendum, and he'll talk more about the sort of process and constitutional issues. The format that we're going to follow is that each speaker will give a brief introduction to themselves and some of what they think are the key issues, and then we'll move to questions from the audience. We asked you for questions in advance. Many people submitted some very good, high-quality questions. I'll try and call some of those first, but then I hope that we'll have plenty of time to get in other people in the audience, and I'll call questions maybe in groups of 3, give them to the panel, and then come back to you, the audience. So, shall we go this way, starting with Anand? Some introductory words. Delighted that you're here.
Thanks, Meg. And is that working? Good. Good evening. As Meg said, I'm director of the UK in a Changing Europe initiative. And what we've been doing over the last couple of months is we've held over 50 events up and down the country for the general public, so outside of universities in general, where we've just invited people from the region to come and ask questions of academics that they might have about the referendum. These things have been deliberately non-question time type events. They've just been an attempt not to witness a sort of Punch and Judy show like we can see on the telly all too often in this referendum campaign, but simply to come and ask about things they don't understand or they're unsure about this referendum. The UK in a Changing Europe was set up to provide information and nothing more. We're not a campaigning organisation. We don't take sides in the debate. We're totally non-partisan. Our aim is simply to ensure that the public is as informed as it can possibly be before it makes up its own mind on the 23rd of June. So absent our politicians, I hope this will be an opportunity to do that here. Thank you.
I'm Swati Dhingra. I'm a lecturer at the London School of Economics and the Department of Economics and the Centre for Economic Performance. What we've been doing is trying to study what the economic impact of Brexit would be under the different scenarios that have been proposed. And primarily, we want to give an independent analysis and not take sides in terms of saying that it would definitely have a negative impact or a positive impact. It was more an independent exercise to try and estimate what those numbers look like.
Simon.
I'm Simon Usherwood. I'm at the University of Surrey, and I'm also a senior fellow on the UK and a Changing Europe programme. I've been doing work in recent months on social media, which means that I'm finally able to convince my boss that I should be spending all my time on Twitter. One of the things I think that I would echo from what Anand and Meg have said is that people often find it difficult to make up their mind about what they're hearing, that the two campaigns have been concerned as much with attacking each other's credentials as with discussing the issues. And so one of the things I hope we can do today is provide a bit more light to the kinds of questions that you have.
And I'm Alan Rinnick from the Constitution Unit here at UCL. And as Meg hinted, I have been looking at questions of process around the referendum, both the referendum itself, so questions about misinformation in the campaign, but also other questions to do with the role of government ministers, organisations such as the Bank of England, the media in the course of the campaign. And also I've been thinking about the process if we do vote for Brexit. What happens on Friday morning next week if the result is a vote for Brexit, and what's the process of negotiation that leads eventually to the withdrawal of the UK from the EU?
Okay, well, very suddenly we're over to questions. And what I should have said is, of course, we had questions submitted which were targeted at the campaigns and their claims. We can address some of those in a more general sense among this panel, but the whole point of this panel, in the first place, was to be factual and objective and evidence-based. And so I hope we're going to have a very kind of adult, mature, evidence-based discussion here. Nobody's on the panel here to take sides on the big question, but we have some serious experts here, and if you've got questions about the sorts of things that the campaigns have been saying, questions about the things that the campaigns maybe haven't been talking about, that you think they should have been talking about, then you're in the right place to ask some questions. Now, I've got some indications of some of the people who put in questions at the start, who I think are maybe all sitting over here. I'll try calling some of those first, and then coming to the panel. Do we have Rosalind Dews? Yes. Wait for the microphone.
My question is, if we leave the EU, will we have to renegotiate all our existing trade agreements?
Okay. How about Farhan Ahmed?
There are around 1 million voters who are Commonwealth citizens but not British nationals who are eligible to vote in this referendum. What factors do you think should this sub-electorate consider before voting to stay or leave the EU?
And Ashley Pearson? I should tell you these questions are completely unconnected because I want to use the full breadth of people on the panel. I was going to group them by subject, so I'm jumping around the list a bit.
Thank you. If the UK were to leave the EU, is there a danger that efforts to control the migration of EU citizens from the Republic of Ireland to Northern Ireland could jeopardise the peace process?
Who'd like to go first? Swati?
So I'll start with the trade agreements question. In principle, what the World Trade Organization has announced now is that, yes, the UK would have to renegotiate its trade agreements, that those will not be recognized by the WTO, because typically if you're a member of the World Trade Organization and you want to have a trade agreement with another member country, you have to take the permission of the WTO to ensure that you're not trying to sort of give preferences to one country or another country. So the way they do that is that they look for whether there's enough coverage of products under the trade agreement and whether it covers a substantial fraction of the trade between those two countries. If those two criteria are met, typically you can go ahead and have a trade deal. But of course, now that the WTO has ruled that they're not going to recognize the UK as a separate partner of each of these different trade partners that we have with whom the EU has negotiated trade agreements for us, we would have to restart all of those negotiations. In terms of what the sort of usual time frame is, the number of years required to do a trade deal can range from anything like 4 years is what happened with the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement after a white paper had already been circulated by Canada. In terms of what Switzerland has recently seen with China, that took about 10 to 15 years, depending on which estimates you look at. So roughly speaking, we should expect about 10 years of negotiations going forward.
Who'd like to be next?
Just to address the Commonwealth question, which is an interesting one. I mean, one of the things the Commonwealth question does, I think, is it underlines the double uncertainty of this referendum. If you're voting in an election, you look at the promises that the two sides make. You take a healthy dose of cynicism as to whether either side will honour its pledges, and then you vote for the side whose pledges you like best if you think they will honour them. In this referendum campaign, You can do that up to an extent, but with the proviso that the Leave camp might well not be in a position to deliver on their promises even if we vote to leave. If we vote to leave, there's no guarantee that the chief Brexiters will be running the government afterwards. And I say this because one of the issues that's been quite prominent on the Leave side has been the fact that if we leave the European Union, the fact that we will be able to not have free movement of people within Europe will allow us to let more Commonwealth citizens in. You know, for some people in my family, this sounds like quite an attractive option, but what you've got to do is try and figure out whether, in fact, this is something on which they will be able to deliver. So my suggestion to you would be you should look at it like any other voter in this referendum. Don't look at it as a Commonwealth citizen. Look at it as an inhabitant and as someone living in this country, and make up your mind as to what you think on balance will be better for this country in terms of our relationship with the European Union. I wouldn't put too much credence in pledges being made about public policy down the track after we leave. I would look at the question of in or out on its merits quite simply.
Now, I should say not everybody needs to come in on every round. So would either of you like to come in?
Yep.
Yep? Both? Yes?
So
Competing?
on the Irish question, the question of free movement, clearly one of the challenges that would be put in place is that we have a land border with another EU member state, two if you include the tunnel, but that's slightly different. The issue that arises with Northern Ireland and its border with the Republic is that the assumption of the Good Friday peace agreements was that both countries were member states of the European Union, and that facilitated the liberalisation and the removal of border controls between the Republic and Northern Ireland. Now, in terms of what happens if the UK leaves, that remains very unclear. Free movement between the Republic and the UK predates EU membership. It's something which clearly is a very difficult political situation. Again, there's a problem about what options there are. One option is that you reimpose border checks, passport checks at the land border there. Another model, which I've heard mooted, would be that you have a free and open border between the Republic and Northern Ireland, but instead you impose passport checks across the Irish Sea between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. Now, that might solve one problem, but clearly it creates a much larger problem. The truth is that it's not entirely clear how you resolve that issue, but it's one of the things that really does highlight the way in which, when we're thinking about the referendum, that it does touch upon a lot of different areas of constitutional and public policy issues.
Alan.
And just if I can briefly build on what Simon's just said about Ashley's question on Ireland, we have heard considerable concern in two of our seminars, the seminar series that Meg has talked about, in relation to this question from both sides of the border. So, as Simon said, there is uncertainty about what the nature of the border between the North and the Republic would be. In addition, the EU has been a significant player behind the scenes in the Northern Ireland peace process for some decades, and it continues to fund quite a lot of peace initiatives in Northern Ireland. So we certainly have heard many concerns about those sorts of practical initiatives in relation to the peace process, but also the effect upon community relations in Northern Ireland if the issue of whether Northern Ireland is part of the UK or part of the Republic of Ireland is made more salient, more important to people's daily lives by the nature of the border.
Thank you. Let me take another round of questions. Some of these are quite precise, but there's some very interesting questions here. Do we have Simon Grosh? Stephen Grosh, sorry. I'm sorry. On this side.
Thank you very much. One of the Leave campaign's headline claims is that a vote to leave will allow us to take back control of immigration. Now, at the moment, we have control of third country immigration, which accounts for more than half of all immigration. No country in Europe has been able to conclude a trade deal with the EU that doesn't include free movement of people. And in 2014, Switzerland voted to impose immigration quotas, but hasn't been able to implement the vote without abrogating the trade deal that it has with the EU. Are the Leave campaign right when they say that we can limit EU immigration and make a trade agreement with the EU, which accounts for 45% of all our exports?
Do we have Lucy Gaunt?
Given the importance of the Erasmus programme in development of high calibre graduates from UK universities, could the panel comment on what, should we have a Brexit next week, what, if any, the alternative might be and how that might be funded, particularly given the fact that last year the budget for that was €127 million.
I think Richard Jameson isn't here, is that correct? Oh, Richard Jameson is here because your question fitted very nicely with Lucy's question. Why don't you ask the more general one?
My question is very short. What would be the consequences for our universities of our withdrawal from the EU?
Let me take one more, which doesn't fit with that, but is on a much more general question, because I'm quite keen, given we are the Constitution Unit and given some of the expertise on the panel, to talk about sort of process issues and political engagement. Alan Cogbill? Yeah.
Thanks. My question was directed very much at the Leave campaign, so I'm not sure what experts would have to say. I'll adapt. I'll go. Here goes anyway. We're still struggling to undo all the damage of the banking crash and the economic troubles since. The Leave campaign has done very well by unleashing or stoking public anger against institutions, against experts, against people who should know, people we can blame for our woes. To my mind, it is only through people coming together through institutions, national and international, that we can ever get anything done. So my question was, can you see any way in which, after the referendum, the proponents of Leave could seek to rebuild public trust or to rally people behind a more positive programme of action? Or is it just about protest? It's not really about effective action at all.
Should we start at this end this time?
Let me go on Alan's question, which is a great question and a very, very difficult question. So I agree with the premise that the campaign has been shocking in the degree to which institutions that have long been regarded as sources of authoritative information and expertise have been trashed. And that applies to public institutions such as the Bank of England. It applies to the general body of academic expertise. It applies to think tanks such as the Institute for Fiscal Studies and international organizations such as the WTO and the World Bank and so on. I think it is rather difficult to see how those bridges can be rebuilt. And I think that is part of a wider tendency in our politics that we've seen not just in the UK but also notably in the United States in recent months, of a rise of a populist discourse in politics. And I think that can only really be tackled through fundamental changes, not kind of little words that are said by the campaigners after the campaign is over in order to mend bridges, but by fundamental changes, partly to politics, in order to make politics more deliberative. That is to say, to encourage not just participation in politics, but also thoughtful, careful participation in politics by the widest range of people. But I think ultimately it also requires much more fundamental changes in society. I mean, it's very clear that the degree of distrust towards the establishment that we see in this referendum reflects years of building anger and detachment from the elite in large parts of our society. And I don't think there's any way in which these sorts of problems can be addressed unless, so the political problems can be addressed, unless those much deeper social problems can be addressed, which of course is very, very difficult to do.
Simon?
It's maybe worth saying that the referendum itself, I think, highlights some of those challenges, that it asks us to reduce what is a very complicated issue to a Remain, Leave proposition. And as we saw with Scotland, what does that mean? What do either of those options mean? And it opens up as many questions as it resolves. And I think one of the things that, for me, has been a bit of a frustration in this debate is that neither side has talked about what kind of country do we want? What kind of society are we trying to build? And without that conversation, being in or out of the EU is almost not the main issue at hand. So I echo the point that there is a broader point that comes from that, and a bigger issue that needs to be addressed. If I can just pick up on the question from Stephen about controlling immigration and having a new kind of trade agreement with the EU if we left. The EU's model of agreements with third countries is that if you want full access to the market, or more or less full access to the market, that means full access. So that means you have to have the 4 elements of what makes a market. So that means goods, services, capital, and labour. So you can't have a system where you have free movement of goods and services without having an equivalent liberalisation of free movement. So there is going to be a trade-off if we're in a Brexit scenario, that if you want to have more control or restrictions around EU migrants coming into the UK, that probably comes with an equivalent restriction on what you can organise in terms of other areas of trade. So the EU doesn't always require free movement of people. You can have a much more distant kind of relationship, one which limits itself to something like a free trade area, which doesn't necessarily require free movement. But again, it's one of the issues I think that's already been raised, is that different bits of the Leave campaign will say different things for different reasons, and their ability to follow through on that's one thing, but also the coherence of that package. It's not a package that is worked out, and I think it leaves a lot of questions open.
Anand?
Yeah,
we've got universities.
Yeah, on Erasmus and universities in general, several non-member states of the EU participate in Erasmus, so it's conceivable to see a deal. And actually, this is one of those areas where we start off in a rather strong negotiating position. Far more kids from other member states want to come here than do our students want to go to other universities. I mean, that's been true in the numbers systematically for many years. So if the negotiations are taking place sector by sector, this is one where we could do quite well, but who knows how the negotiations will proceed. But there are ways of seeing that, there are ways of foreseeing a continuation of both research funding and schemes like Erasmus if we're outside the European Union. The broader question about what it means to our universities, again, I mean, part of any answer to a question about the future is going to be to hedge and say it depends on the deal we get. If we go for the EEA, which I think is politically almost impossible, then actually things could stay pretty much as they are. If we were to adopt a non-EEA situation, then I imagine the better universities could do quite well out of a situation where we've left the EU, in that they could simply whack up the full fee to all students, and they are prestigious enough to probably attract enough students. I think it's lower down the university food chain where you would see problems starting, in that you would get a drop-off of numbers. So it would intensify competition amongst universities, and you'd see a greater differentiation amongst universities. I don't think it would necessarily be uniformly bad for the sector as a whole.
I'll add something to Stephen's question about trade agreements. So it's absolutely correct that the EU has not given any deal of late which doesn't include free movement of people, and which is why if the Leave campaign is trying to sort of propose a trade agreement which doesn't include that, that's very unlikely because it's also going to set off potentially renegotiations from other countries. That being said, there is really not an economic case for immigration to be stopped from the EU because we know it has contributed positively to the fiscal surplus. It has not harmed British workers' wages or employment prospects, and people have looked very carefully at this even during the time period of the financial crisis when demand was low and when you would have seen sort of the biggest negative impacts. So in that sense, there isn't an economic case, but of course one can argue that there's a potentially political, cultural case there.
Okay, let me give you a warning that I think I have enough for one more round of questions, and then I'm going to open it out to those of you who haven't had an indication that your question has been selected. We had plenty of questions submitted, and we selected very few because initially the first half an hour of this was going to be the two sides presenting their case and discussing with each other, and the audience was going to be a little bit squeezed out. We have lots more time for the audience now, so those of you who haven't had an indication that your question has been called, prepare to ask a question on the next round, but I'm just going to call 3 more people for the next round, and then we'll just open it up completely. We have Clive Poole, and what I haven't done actually, again because I thought we weren't going to have much time, is I haven't done what we usually do, which is encourage people to introduce themselves, tell us anything about yourself that might be relevant in terms of your profession or your organisation. Otherwise, if you're just a member of the public, that's fine too.
Okay, I can tell you something about myself. I work at UCL in the EE department. My question is, the Remain side claim that remaining in the EU offers the best hope of achieving much needed reform of EU institutions. But will not a Remain vote on the 23rd of June be seen as an endorsement of the status quo, thereby weakening Britain's bargaining position in regard to these reforms?
Thank you. And Inez JJ? Maybe I haven't said the name right. Inez JJ?
Over here in the middle, yes.
Ah. Yes?
Sorry. Wave. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm Vanessa. I'm a Year 12 student in Kent, and I want to become a doctor, so that's why my question is on the NHS. So I was like, what would leaving the EU mean for the NHS? Is it overly optimistic to suggest that funding will increase?
Thank you. And then Andrew Livesey. We told the questioners to sit in this corner so that I could try and ensure that I called them. I'm not biased towards this corner, and you're all next.
Hi, I'm Andrew Livesey. I live in North Norfolk. I've come down especially today to be in this great institution. Just a quick aside here. The view up in North Norfolk for people generally is it's 60% to leave and 40% to remain. I just thought you'd like to know that. Now, my question is, have Cameron and Osborne's scare stories actually helped the Vote Leave case?
Start with somebody new. Simon?
I think that there's clearly a process issue, if I start off with Andrew's question, that it's kind of an echo of the previous round of questions that came from Alan about trust and how you rebuild that. That the difficulty that both sides have had is that they have a good reason, or it seems like a logical reason to engage in talking down the other side and raising concerns about the alternative. For the Remain side, they have the weight of the status quo, to come back to that question that Clive asked. But in terms of motivating people, a slogan of what do we want, pretty much what we've got now, when do we want it, well, we've more or less got it now, isn't going to get people out on the streets and whipped up. And so it's given a reason for Remain campaigners to point out that, you know, if all these things we might lose if we leave. And so there has been a tendency to talk up the downsides of exit. At the same time, Leave have had, if you like, the opposite problem, that because they are a very broad church, as we've already discussed this evening, they don't have a plan. There are a range of ideas, a range of different models of what they might do, although how they achieve what they might do is left open. And as such, the points of common reference that they have is what's the reason for leaving, and they can talk about the problems, you know, all the things that might be coming down the line with the EU, all the problems that we have at the moment. So structurally, there are incentives in terms of what's going to get people motivated to vote for those kinds of things. And I think that is a problem. And yes, you know, the general effect is that we end up thinking that everyone is not really being very constructive. And it is a bit of a frustration that neither side has a strong plan for what comes forward. In terms of the question about, you know, would a Remain vote be an endorsement of the status quo? I think one of the things that has been clear is that the EU is not a static object. It's as much as anything, it's a framework for states to produce useful outputs. They do things together that they can't do by themselves. And as such, there's always new things in the pipeline. So the status quo is one thing, but the status quo is not actually a status quo. It's a moving object. So I'm not sure that it comes at a price of saying, well, now that UK has voted to stay in, it must enthusiastically sign up to everything that's going. That's clearly not going to be the case, and there is no way that that can be done in any legal framework.
In fact, we seem to be moving now to a sort of Scottish situation where the Remain people are beginning to argue that Remain means change.
Yes.
While the Leave people are maybe claiming that we can stick with what we want. Swati, do you want to answer on the NHS and whatever else takes your fancy?
I'll start with actually the scaremongering question, primarily because that's something that economists are very much targeted, that's very much targeted towards economists, an overwhelming consensus of economists, and I mean in the order of 95% plus, agree that Brexit is going to have severe negative impacts on the British economy, and quite often what is said about both George Osborne's analysis of it as well as independent people's analysis of it is that this is just scaremongering, this is fear-mongering. So even sort of giving the facts out there is being, we start to get tainted either way. So I really want to make the point that everything that's sort of labeled as fear-mongering need not be that, and there's interest on both sides to make it out to be so. In terms of the NHS, what I can argue is that where the NHS sort of has suffered over the past few years is really got much more to do with austerity cuts rather than to do with immigrants coming into the country and causing sort of NHS to be overstretched. So if you look at whether you look at NHS waiting times or you look at sort of the number of people, EU immigrants that actually use the NHS, you don't really tend to find any sort of really strong correlation between EU immigrants in the community and the NHS waiting times or the NHS outcomes. So it's really a matter of sort of how much future funding will be available to the NHS, and in that sense it's not clear. I mean, that's a question of the domestic budget. It's not really got much to do with the European Union per se.
Anand?
I just want to add something very quickly to all three things. On Clive's question about reforming EU institutions, the EU is very, very hard to reform at the moment, partly because the member states disagree on so much. But in terms of our ability to get what we want should we vote to remain in, that's going to depend a lot on what attitude we have towards the European Union on the 24th, have we voted to stay in. So if you think about it, you remember the day after the Scottish referendum, David Cameron came out and surprised us all with his little speech about English votes on English laws. It'll be very, very interesting to see what he says on the morning of the 24th, should we decide to stay in. He could say, the British people have decided, we are now going to re-engage as a full and leading member of the European club and take the place we should have had from the start. I find that very, very unlikely given the state of his party and the probable strength of UKIP coming out of this referendum. I suspect that he'll come out on the 24th and say, the British people have voted grudgingly in a surly manner to stay in a club, and I promise to protect you from it against all the threats it will impose on us in the years to come, which will mean that we will remain at best a bad-tempered, semi-detached member, and our ability to shape what goes on, there's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy about this. If you're semi-detached and you don't punch your weight, the club's not going to reflect your interests as much as if you're fully engaged and playing your full role. On the NHS, the simple point to make is this: whatever is said about the savings from the EU budget, they would pale into insignificance in comparison to the loss to the exchequer if even half of the predictions of the economists prove to be true. Losses in terms of 2% of GDP are bigger by a scale of magnitude than anything we will get back from the EU budget. So that's the crucial question about all public services is, do you expect our economy to contract, stay the same, or to grow? Because actually, compared to those sort of numbers, our budget contribution is trivial. And finally, on fear, 2 points on fear. One, it's very popular to say, oh my God, this is a fear-based campaign. The fact of the matter is, as far as I can see, fear works. Fear worked in Scotland. If you want the politics of poetry, you should watch The West Wing. Don't expect it, Don't expect it in real life, because politicians do this because ultimately it works, and it is too soon to judge the Remain campaign yet. It's very clear what their strategy is. They are living in a country where people don't like the European Union. Overwhelmingly, 67% of the British are classified as Eurosceptic by pollsters, okay? So we're not going to like the EU because of a 2-month campaign. So how do you make us vote to stay in? You make us vote to stay in by getting people who go around telling their mates in the pub that I don't like the EU and I'm tempted to vote against it. Once they're in the seclusion of the voting booth, just to think for a split second, oh my God, mortgage. And they'll come out feeling probably a little bit unclean, a little bit embarrassed, a little bit ashamed of themselves, but, and maybe lie to as well. But ultimately, that seems to be the rationale behind the Remain campaign, is that ultimately it's that last few seconds that matters, not the 2 months that goes before. And the second thing I would say is, there is no way in this country, in the space of a referendum campaign, to run a positive campaign about the European Union. Because there are 2 steps to having a positive view of the European Union, and the first is to admit your inadequacies as a nation state acting by yourself. And we haven't done that first step yet in this country. We haven't admitted to national weakness, and unless you admit to national weakness, you can't appreciate the European Union as a way of reinforcing you. And to expect a political campaign to undertake that within the space of a few weeks, I think would be very, very unrealistic.
Hold on. Hold on. You'll get your chance to ask a question in a minute or make a comment. Alan, you've done a lot on opinion change in referendum campaigns, and you may also have something general to say about negativity.
I think most of what I wanted to say has already been said, but just on the matter of opinion change in referendums, yes, it is the case. So I've been doing a study where we gather every opinion poll that we can find on every referendum that we can find in democratic countries in recent decades, and we've got polls from over 200 referendums now. And what you see is, on the whole, opinion shifts towards the status quo in the final stages of a referendum campaign. It doesn't always happen, but it typically happens. There have been some votes recently where, and I should say, and that seems to be because of the sorts of things that Anand has been mentioning. People get fearful of just what is change going to mean when it comes closer to the actual decision. We have had some votes recently where things have gone, at least to some extent, in the opposite direction. The Scottish referendum that Meg mentioned is very interesting. For most of the campaign, opinion in Scotland was shifting towards independence, towards the change option. Even there, however, at the very end of the campaign, just in the last week or so, there was again a bit of a shift back to the status quo. So that's what we tend to find in referendum campaigns, tends, as Anand was saying, to suggest that Project Fear tends to win.
But on that occasion, a vote no became a vote for change, didn't it? Because of the vow.
Absolutely.
Which is a twist.
And I think, as I think Anand was again hinting, and Simon as well, it seems to me that we've got to the stage that even if we got a massive Remain vote, which is obviously not looking very likely just at the moment, but even if we did, the kind of campaign dynamics that have built up over the campaign are such that when David Cameron goes out and gives that speech on Friday morning, his mindset is going to be so affected by the negativity towards the EU, the dissatisfaction towards the EU, that is going to dominate the UK's future attitudes towards that institution.
Okay, let's go over to you. I've got questions that I want to ask, and if you don't ask them, I may come in at the end and ask some of the really excellent points that were raised by other questioners who I have got down as not having turned up. If I haven't called you as a questioner, even though your question was indicated for calling, do put your hand up, and I'll try and get as many people in as I can in 2 or 3 rounds before one final shot from me. Okay, man on the gangway here. Is there a microphone that can go here? And then there's a woman in the middle, right in the middle here. And then let's take one from each side. There's a man right at the back up there.
If we should vote to leave on the 23rd, the two
Can
things...
you tell us your name and any
Sorry,
relevant
my name
details?
is Farida Farah. I'm a barrister. My name is Farida Farah. There are 2 aspects that I have been worried about that nobody seems to have discussed. That is, if we do vote to leave on the 23rd, what is the situation about travelling to other European countries? Will we need visas? That's my first question. And the second question is, what is the situation about our national currency, the sterling? Will it weaken? And what would the rate of exchange possibly be against the euro for people who want to travel, buy property abroad? Yes.
You've got the right person here, I
So these 2 questions have been worrying me myself, and nobody's discussed them, especially sterling. Thank you.
Thank you. While Ben takes the microphone up there, let's have this question here. Tell us who you are.
I'm Mike Buttolph, I'm a scientist. This is prompted by Stephen saying that neither side has set out a clear plan, though you rather get the impression that Cameron has spent a lot of his time talking about what will happen if the Leave side wins. But of course, this is a referendum and not a general election. And so we're stuck with this paradox that we're simply asked to answer a question yes or no, but nobody is called upon formally to say, if I am elected, I will form a government, I will do this, that, or the other. And I just would be interested to hear what the panel has to say about what might be done about this, because there's a tendency for commentators to fall into this way of thinking that here we have people advocating for whatever it is, but they haven't explained to us what will happen when we get whatever it is. But as I say, it isn't obvious that there's any obligation on either side to say what we'll get if we get whatever it is, if you see what I mean. Thank you.
Thank you. And the man at the back. I think it's a man, I'm sorry.
Yes. Hope so. Andrew Keckwick. The Ipsos Mori poll stating 90% of economists believe Remain is good. Why did only 17% of those polled answer and 83% not respond? This doesn't seem to be generally reported.
Anand, I don't think we've started around with you as yet. Go first?
I'll let you speak for your profession. Okay, so I'd like to say because they can't write, but just on the question from over there, nothing at all can be done about it. And this is the referendum paradox. It's a one-shot game. In an election, someone promises something, they win, they fail to deliver, you can punish them next time. Nick Clegg. Okay? In a referendum, you say what you can say to win. And there is no comeback. Absolutely no comeback. You win or you lose. And that's one of the reasons why the debate has taken the form it has. Because there is no second chance in this. And that's just inherent in the nature of referendums, I'm afraid. It's very hard to think of a decent mechanism you can use. You know, there's been all this talk about a regulatory body to fact-check political campaigns. I just can't see that becoming a reality. It will be far too difficult, far too tricky to do. And I think, you know, this is one of the problems with referendums. Like them or loathe them, they are going to be like this because it will be a one-shot thing.
So one of the questions I was going to come in with at the end, which fits here, I think, is, and I'm going to go to Alan next, is should we be wary? I mean, I said at the beginning we've only held 3 national referendums in the UK. Does this make us want to be a bit cautious about holding more? Are they a good democratic vehicle?
I mean, this is a matter of taste rather than analysis, I suppose. I'm not a fan of referendums. I rather think I elect people to make these decisions, otherwise why would I elect them in the first place? The problem is we live in an age of populist politics. Well, I remember about 10 years ago I did a Radio 5 phone-in with John Pienaar, and he asked me at the start, what do you think of referendums? And I just said, well, look, I'm not saying that people can't understand the Lisbon Treaty. What I'm saying is, you know, I'm sure I could change my boiler if I put my mind to it, but I make a decision that I'd rather pay someone and save the time and effort. And that's largely how I see politics. And the next hour of the phone-in was dominated with people ringing up, calling me an elitist snob. And that is the problem with politics at the moment. It is very, very hard for a contemporary politician to say no when someone is calling for the people to be allowed to voice their opinion.
Alan, referendums as democratic vehicles, and can they be regulated?
Well, I think one thing before we get to that, I'd like to do something that no one's yet done and disagree with another panelist, if I may. Just he's a long way away. I think I'm safe. I'm not sure there is no comeback on the politicians, because the way in which the politicians are behaving at the moment, how is the Conservative Party going to behave after this referendum? How are they going to manage to hold together? How is whoever is the leader of the Conservative Party after all of this going to manage to govern effectively and, with a majority of 12 MPs? How many are likely to rebel against whatever the leader of the party decides to do? So it seems to me that the politicians who have been engaged in this campaign on both sides are going to suffer after the 23rd as a result of their behaviour in this campaign. And they're going to be pretty unlikely to want to rush to another referendum because, of course, this referendum was held in order to hold the Conservative Party together. And we know what we have seen. So, to some extent it may be that the experience of this referendum means that we don't have to be quite concerned about thinking of other forms of improving referendum campaigns, because we're not going to have so many of them, potentially, as a result of this experience. But if we do have more referendums, then certainly I do think that we need to think very seriously about how to improve the way in which they are conducted. And Anand is clearly right to say that there are big concerns about whether it would be appropriate to have some kind of formal fact-checking process and mechanism through which campaigners are told what you are saying is not true, stop saying it. This does work in some other countries. In New Zealand, notably, the Electoral Commission does have a role in giving a lot of information about the options and does intervene and tells the campaigners not to say things if they are saying things that are deemed not to be correct. There's a little bit of that goes on in Irish referendums as well. So these things do take place. But again, going back to what we were talking about earlier about the current anti-establishment mood, if we had a body from the establishment saying, no, that's wrong, you can't say it.
Would we like it even better?
Indeed. It's unlikely that the Daily Mail is going to listen. Or many people would not listen. So then we have to think about, well, what other mechanisms can we devise in order to create incentives for the politicians and the campaigners to be less dishonest in the course of campaigns? And ultimately, the only way to address that problem is to change how we, the voters, decide how we're going to vote. If we were if we were a bit more sensitive to misinformation, if we were not so swayable by nonsense, then the politicians wouldn't talk nonsense. So how do you create a political system in which that becomes more possible? It's very difficult, but I think you need fundamental reform to the system as a whole. You need to encourage, as I suggested very briefly earlier, a more deliberative style of politics in which we're all engaged so far as possible in talking carefully about political issues. Clearly, Anand is right that many of us just don't want to engage in politics to that degree, but our democratic system is fundamentally important to our lives. And if that democratic system cannot function effectively without our more careful participation, then we need to try to do something about that.
Swati, we had some nice questions about sterling and about economic opinion.
So my only answer to that would be this: the question that was raised at the back was about why only 17% of the economists responded to a poll that was sent out by The Guardian asking whether what is going to be the economic impact of Brexit. My only answer to that is we understand economic incentives very well, and we were not going to reply to that unless you paid us money to do it. And which is why when people's reputation was at stake, when they were, being cajoled to do a poll because somebody from the LSE was writing to them or somebody from the Royal Economic Society was writing to them, and overwhelmingly 600 economists replied, and they did find that yes, there are going to be negative impacts, and that majority was also about 90%. So in that sense, I'll make an excuse for my profession at this point, but of course, one should just question the kinds of polls that are being churned out by giving just blanket surveys to people to fill them out. And unfortunately, even the YouGov polls, which try and chart out what these referendum results would be, have awful sample selection problems. So in terms of national currency, I think going by what the experience has been over the past few months, it looks like the sterling would dip, which is what happened when Boris Johnson announced that he was going to support the Leave campaign. So that would potentially happen. In terms of whether that uncertainty has already kicked in, we've seen a lot more volatility. And what we've also seen in sort of real terms, not sort of looking at just the financial nominal outcomes, but looking at real outcomes, we know what has already happened is that recruitment companies are not hiring very much. 17% of them have completely stopped hiring in the second quarter. 25% of them have moved to short-term contracts. M&A activity is down, investments are down. Now, is that going to have a permanent impact, or whether that's going to immediately bounce back is a lot more difficult to say, and I think that really would depend on the sort of verdict that comes out. If it's a really close result, we might see the uncertainty continue for some more time, mainly because people are still going to question whether Brexit is going to happen or not.
Simon.
Just on the question of travel limits.
Yes, thank you.
It's very hard to see a situation where your ability to travel would be severely limited. It might be that you have additional passport checks, but in terms of additional visa requirements, that's unlikely to happen. What might change, though, is something that is more than just travel, that if you have, for example, a second home, and I'm sure most of us do in this room, in the EU, that if you have that, then there might be issues, depending on what the deal is that is negotiated in a Brexit scenario, that might be some changes about what conditions you can have that second property, whether there are changes in your legal status relative to that state, whether that changes your taxation status, your residency requirements. But again, that is something which is, at this stage, really very imponderable. I think the second point on that, though, is that even if everybody in the country voted to leave next Thursday, I'm assuming isn't going to happen, because that'd be outside the margin of error on opinion polls, and even the opinion polls won't be that wrong, the UK doesn't leave at that point. So on the 24th, nothing changes except David Cameron has a press conference, and some of us have to do interviews. So until the UK actually leaves, which might take the 2 years that is set out in the treaty, might take longer, might take shorter, but it looks unlikely it'll take shorter, the UK remains a member state, so your rights for free movement remain. Just on the point about opinion polls, you might have seen something that said that 92% of fishermen support Brexit. Now, I was involved in putting together that survey with a colleague up at Aberdeen. I can tell you that our response rate was 10%. Now, that was 120 skippers, which again gives you a size indication of the British fleet. So it's not very big. Now, the point I'd make is an extension of Swati's, which is that it might be that the other 90% of fishing skippers support membership. However, they haven't responded. And if you look at the evidence that we have, those people who have expressed opinions, not in surveys, but in terms of action and activity, whether that's on the Thames or anywhere else, you would assume that actually most fishermen do support Brexit. So there's nothing to stop economists who think that there will be benefit to leaving economically to express that opinion. And there are individuals, not many of them, who have that opinion. So again, one of the things I think we'd be saying is, opinion polls, as we all should know at this point, are not a be-all and end-all. They give us an indication, and we should use our common sense and judgment about what that means and what that doesn't mean.
Maybe we should conclude that 90% of fishermen aren't that bothered.
Yeah.
I'm tempted to say, for the webcasting, I think the point about second homes, if you're getting the wrong impression about UCL students and academics, I think that was irony. We've certainly got time for one more round. If we have quick questions and quick answers, we'll get in two more. I have a sense that answers are getting a little longer. So if we keep it speedy, we'll get in two more rounds. There's a woman there in a blue t-shirt.
Hi, I'm Clara Morell. I'm a student in Year 12, and I was wondering how likely do you think it is that David Cameron will stand down if we choose to leave the EU?
Good question. The man waving the paper in the middle there.
Hi, my name is Leo, and I'm a treasury accountant. I just got two questions.
Quick.
All right. The Remain campaign is saying we've got access to 500 million customers in Europe. If we look at Romania, Poland, Greece, Spain, they've got double-figure unemployment. So out of that 500 million, how many are unemployed? And the second question with the NHS, if you've got European residents going back, say, to Poland with the EU health card, getting a hip replacement, and then it gets recharged back to the NHS. Does that make sense?
And then there's a woman down here. Hands are going up all over, and people are going to be disappointed. My apologies.
Hello. My question is very simple.
Could you tell us who you are?
My name's Lily, and I work at a TV production company. My question is basically, can everyone just say really, really quickly what the worst thing about the EU is?
Nice question. Swati, would you like to go first this time?
On what?
And on any of those?
Sorry, I missed the question there about NHS, but I'll talk about the worst thing about the EU. So I think
there's a nice economic question from up there.
There's an important point there about we don't want a huge political union which is run by sort of people who are, 5 steps away, removed from us. So there's a perfectly legitimate political argument to be made about why you want more accountability. But if you're trying to give an economic point of view, there is really no case for Brexit based on the economics of it. Based on the politics of it, you can argue, but...
Well, let me call you on the next round, okay? I'll call you on the next round. I think the panel are trying to answer the questions in as objective a manner as they can, but if you think that the debate is going the wrong way, ask a question on the next round. Okay? Did you want to take the question from up here?
I couldn't hear it, actually.
He was asking about the market in Europe and the fact that there's allegedly this great market, but actually there's a lot of countries in recession. if I'm understanding you correctly.
So this is an argument that's often made that because the EU is declining, somehow if we unshackle ourselves from the European Union, we would then be able to strike up great trade deals with China, with India, with the US, which are equally important markets. There is one fallacy in that argument, which is that we have tried that. The EU-India FTA is one of them, which the EU-India trade agreement was one of them, which the EU did try to negotiate on behalf of the UK. And one of the main sort of obstacles to the EU-India FTA going through was precisely the UK. It was not the rest of the European Union. It was because the Indian side was pushing very hard for mobility restrictions to be removed. But more importantly, the sort of more important point here is trade agreements anymore are not about tariffs. They are about harmonization of regulations. Are we willing to harmonize our toy safety directives with those of China or India, or even sort of have the NHS be run by potentially private companies from the United States? Those are domestic decisions we have to make, and we have to take a stance on them. That is not, we can go ahead and do them if as a society that's what we decide. But if that's not what we want, then being part of the EU and having market access to the EU is where we're going to be able to sell, because most countries, this is an overwhelming empirical fact, most countries sell to countries close to them that are rich and with whom they have some kind of historical ties of trade. And that's what the European Union is for us.
Okay, let's try and keep it snappy so that we can come back to the audience. Simon, the man down here might be satisfied if you told us something bad about the EU.
Okay. The EU is grindingly slow in making decisions. It frustrates the ambitions of any one country or actor, politician who wants to get something done. Well, that's Europe. We'll get to that. But that is the worst thing about it. It means that nobody is able to direct this system. I'm also going to suggest that that's the best thing about it, because it means, we talk about this is run by Brussels, or this is run by Angela Merkel, that she sits in her office and makes things happen. She doesn't, nor does Jean-Claude Juncker, nor does Martin Schulz, or any of the other people that you hear from in the press. The system is based on compromise. Now that makes it really slow and really hard to change, as has been suggested here. Now that is a frustration, but if it has some things that you think are good about it, it means that they are relatively protected. The payoff is that if there are things you think are bad about it, they are also relatively protected.
We'll come to you. Anand.
Just let me answer the first question on David Cameron. He will stand down if we vote to leave. He might. I'm not channeling him now. He didn't say that. I'm saying that because I just think it's.
Please. So, who will we get in his place?
I've no idea who will get in his place. But I think it would just be untenable for him to stay on, having campaigned so hard for one outcome, for the British people to give him the other one. He might stay on for a while until they elect a successor. What's the worst thing about the European Union? It'll be more than 24 hours. It'll be more than 24 hours because the Brexiters want him to take the unpopular decisions that will need to be taken straight after we leave. So he'll be gone, I agree. Okay, well, we'll reconvene on the 25th. The worst thing about the European Union, I think, is that European integration has gone far too far. And by that I mean, when European integration was about creating a market, it was fine. Since the early 1990s, where it's expanded into other areas, be it foreign policy, be it migration policy, be it the euro, what has happened is it's become trapped in this horror situation where it's the worst of all worlds. It has the power to be associated with policy in these areas, but no power to take decisions. So, take the migrant crisis. The European Commission can suggest quotas. The member states are perfectly free to turn around and say, get lost. And there's this horrible overweening sense of paralysis that is true in the Eurozone as well. And for me, the great fear about the European Union because of this is it's become part of the problem rather than part of the solution, in the sense that European integration was invented to put an end to nationalism, to wear down the rough edges between nation states, and for many years it probably did that. Now I think it is actually the reason why nationalist insurgent parties are doing so well across Europe. And the sad thing is, that's very kind of you, and the sad thing is, I don't easily see a way out of this. And, you know, whenever I say this to someone, they say, so what's the solution? And I go, no clue. And that's the answer. And, well, maybe that is I'm not convinced that is a solution. You know, actually, to be fair, I don't know. But I think the European Union is trapped in this horrible cul-de-sac at the moment, and one of the results of that are the politics we see across the member states.
Alan, very quick. I need to take this gentleman down here. I might take one more, and then I'm going to ask some closing questions.
Well, I don't pretend to be an expert on the EU, so I won't claim to have a view on the question of what's worst about it. But
tell us about the Tory party.
Yes, Anand is exactly right to say that David Cameron would go if there is a vote to leave, but he cannot go in 24 hours because he is constitutionally obliged to remain as Prime Minister until his successor is in place. So, and that will take some time for the Conservative Party, if the Conservative Party holds together, to elect a new leader. So he will announce his resignation very quickly, but it will take some time before he actually stops being Prime Minister.
Okay, now, I promised I'd take the gentleman down here if he still wants to come in, and I will take, I think, one person from over here, and then because we need to finish in just 11 minutes, I'm just going to throw in one final question for everybody to close the whole thing off.
Hi,
the gentleman down here.
My name is Josh. I'm an engineer here. And the question, what really is important about this whole debate is about asking the real questions that's going to affect everybody's lives. For example, the controls and also the change and the decline, how this totalitarian system is declining. Now, we've looked at the EU, for example, through the 10 years period of time. There hasn't been no growth. Now, look at China, look at Singapore, look at India. They're doing fantastic well. Now, we've got the Commonwealth countries which we've turned our back on. The reason why there hasn't been any economic growth is because there hasn't been any trade deals with these countries. Now, if you talk about agriculture...
If you could keep it short, because we are running out of time.
If we talk about agriculture and the way we can extend our GDP and allow us to trade with many other countries, just like how the United States are doing. And a lot of them, I've been to so many panels, everybody keep comparing England to Canada. We're different from them. We're special in the EU. Most of their exports comes to the EU. This is a financial hub. They need them more than we need us. So we can always make a better case for renegotiation and trade deals.
Thank you. Thank you. And then I can see a woman down here. Let me take this woman here, and this is going to be the last one from the audience. Apologies to everyone else.
Hi, my name is Abigail. I'm a primary school teacher. My question is about looking to the future. In essence, it is the future of the EU bright or bleak?
Oh, good question. Let me throw in one last thing for everyone to end on, I think, because I don't dare do two more rounds. And there were some really nice questions that came from the audience that we didn't get because the people wanting to ask the question didn't come. If the outcome is leave, what happens next? And if the outcome is remain, what happens next? What's the aftermath of either of those outcomes? And one question which was going to be asked to the two sides, which was going to be our closing question. Do you think that in the event of either outcome, the losing side will accept the outcome? Or are we stuck in this debate forever? Anand.
I'm not going to go through all of these. Abigail, I'd say bleak. So that's that one. Will we accept the outcome? My fear is that if we have a narrow remain on the back of a relatively low turnout, and Nigel Farage has already said this, that the politics of the Conservative Party plus a possible resurgence of UKIP mean that we will end up doing this again. It might become the price of winning the Tory leadership election, but I can foresee that the result won't hold and that we might have to go through another referendum at a later date. We will at some point anyway, because by law we have to in the event of another treaty. But and there are rocky things ahead. I mean, we have to see whether David Cameron's renegotiation gets properly passed, that the court holds it up, that the court doesn't rule that the emergency brake is discriminatory, which it seems to me it is. So there are plenty of pitfalls ahead. So that's in terms of will the result hold. Actually, I'll tell you what, I'll let everyone else have a say because it's the last question. So.
You want to go next? Yeah.
So in terms of the economy, perfectly legitimate point that the rest of the world is growing, China, India, US, which is what I mentioned, but while the EU is not growing as fast. Nothing stops us from trading with those other countries. What it stops us from doing is having trade deals with them because that's a competence we have ceded to the European Union. And that's where I'm trying to make the point. If we have concerns about sovereignty and we want to negotiate alone with the US, that's going to be much more a question of losing sovereignty than if we were to do it with the European Union, which is a fairly equally matched partner. I've already talked about the EU-India FTA, which is largely held up because the UK doesn't want to go ahead with it. In terms of sort of what this means broadly about why in the future we might see other shares increase, of course they might increase. But we're not being constrained to trade with those other countries in the first place. And if you think that EU regulations are the ones that are constraining us, half of the estimated costs of EU regulations comes from the climate change renewable energy strategy of the European Union and from the working time directives. And one might argue about whether these are worth having or not, but this is not something which is red tape from the EU shackling us to the EU and not letting us trade with India or with China. Germany is in the EU and managing to trade quite well with them.
Simon.
It's been a long day. I'd say the EU's future looks bleak at the moment. But let me just elaborate on that. I'm unfortunately old enough to remember the crisis before the one we're in now. The EU has operated in an almost permanent state of crisis of different orders, and this is a particularly bad position that the EU is in. The fact that the EU has managed to weather those various crises through the decades, almost since its inception, I think illustrates that the countries that make up the EU see some value in making that work. So it's a bit of a cop-out answer. It might be bleak, but it doesn't mean that the system is doomed to fail. And if the UK does leave, then it doesn't mean that the EU falls apart. It's that it finds some other kind of accommodation. So the EU is exceptionally good at muddling through, and it's not attractive, and it's not very transparent, and it's not necessarily very democratic, but it is something which is a persistent organisation. In terms of respect of the outcome, I can very easily imagine several scenarios where the side that doesn't get what it wanted finds a way to press the point. You could imagine a scenario where a not strongly skeptic leadership takes over in the event of an exit, starts to negotiate the exit treaty, finds some kind of concession which it feels it might be able to bundle up as a concession, the deal that David Cameron didn't get, and then try and sell that back to the British public as, well, if we could stay in on these revised terms, we think that actually gives us what we want. I think that's an atrocious way of doing it, not least because I can't think of any concession the EU would give that it hasn't already given. So I think there is an issue about the respect of the outcome, particularly if the opinion polls are right, he said laughingly, that it's a very close, if it's a very close result either way, let's say it's just a relief vote, could David Cameron get away with saying, it's such a big decision, we need some more time to check that we've made the right decision. And he's on his way out, but he might try that, and we would all remember this conversation.
Alan, we're in the last 3 minutes. Do your best to tell us about what happens next and whether people accept the outcome. And if you can't fit in all of what happens next, you might want to refer to a blog post where people can find details, that kind of thing.
which I'm just in the process of writing. So there is a previous one from January that's already available. We will be publishing a blog post probably on Monday on what happens. What we can say with certainty about what happens in the event of either a Remain vote or a Leave vote is absolutely nothing. So there is nothing that we can say with certainty because the referendum is purely advisory. It has no legal effect whatsoever. David Cameron could, in principle, simply ignore the result of the referendum. Now, of course, that's pretty unlikely. What we can say with almost complete certainty is that whatever the result, on the 24th of June next week, Friday next week, David Cameron will come out and give a press conference. And what he says in that press conference is extremely important for what then happens. If it is a vote to leave, then the process is set out, as Simon said earlier, in Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty. We indicate to the EU that we plan to leave. There's then a 2-year window that opens up during which we negotiate the terms of our departure. Some people say that we can somehow leave without using that Article 50 process. They're almost certainly wrong. There's no reason why the other European countries would accept any alternative process because that process, the Article 50 process, skews the balance of power in the negotiations in favour of the remaining member states. You might say, aha, they were cunning, weren't they? They did that deliberately in order to stop us from leaving. That might be true, but nevertheless that is the reality, that because there is only a 2-year window, and that window can be extended only with the unanimous agreement of all of the member states, and because the negotiations are going to be complex and are probably going to need more than 2 years, we need the support of all the other member states in order to get the sort of negotiated outcome that we want, and we're going to have to make concessions to them in order to get that. So it's going to be a complex process. I see it's now 7:30, so I better stop at that point and say further details will be available on the Constitution Unit blog on Monday.
Thank you very much. Now, we changed the format of this event in very terrible, tragic circumstances, and it was a great loss to us that we didn't have the two sides here, and that's a source of great regret. But I hope that you agree that we have nonetheless had a wonderful, rich, and enlightening discussion here. If you want to review any of what was said, the video should, I hope, barring further disaster, be available on our website very soon, hopefully tomorrow. I encourage you to keep looking at the stuff that we're producing and that our partner organisations are producing. I would just like to end by doing two things. One, thanking the organisers, Demetrios and Ben, who have done a fantastic job in putting this event together and in keeping it... In keeping it on the road when we discovered at about 4 o'clock this afternoon that everything was going to have to change. We're tremendously grateful to you. And equally, I'm fantastically grateful to our 4 wonderful members of the panel who also had to change their plans and their format and their presentations at the very last minute. You've done a terrific job. You've been a great audience. Thank you. And our intention was not to tell you how to vote, but to inform the debate, and I hope that whatever you do, if you've got a vote, that you will use it next Thursday. Thank you.
I always get them. I always get the UKIP guys. I have a friend in the audience.